Destiny 2 is home to one of the most conflicting communities the world has ever seen, where egoing, spiteful actions, and just the most unhappy people in life tend to be. And all of this boils down to simply what weapon you are trying to use. If you're new to Destiny, let me be the first to tell you that this is nothing new. It's been in the roots of the game for as long as Destiny has ever even been an idea, and it has caused so much controversy that I think it is high time to discuss the logistics for the potentially most centered mechanic in gaming, let alone Destiny 2. That would be damage. And if you don't want your favorite exotic nerfed into next week, then consider subscribing. Trust me, it works. Bungie is monitoring my analytics. If they don't see your name on the list, you can say goodbye to that god roll lucky raspberry. Now back to the message. Damage is the main reason anything in any game would ever get nerfed or buffed. And believe it or not, damage is not the first thing that developers are looking at when deciding a nerf or a buff. No, developers are looking at usage rates. And usage is a stat that Bungie actively checks and even bestows that stat upon us in the form of its API. Destiny Tracker shows close to everything Bungie is seeing. And when they see a weapon that just destroys the competition for the other weapons in its field, they start looking into why that is. And in most cases, in terms for the weapons, it's a good chance that its damage is the reason. Now getting into the topic of damage, you as the player need to know two equally important terms. That would be total damage and DPS, damage per second. These terms are equally important if you look at them as a whole, but when in the gameplay loop, your idea is to gauge the fight by many factors, which is the heart for this entire video. We will be going over all key points such as how long is the boss fight, what is the most viable weapon to use, and ease of use. So getting into our very first point, observing the duration of the boss fight. Throughout every raid in Destiny 2, the bosses never had stagnant time for damage, and this time variable is possibly the most healthy thing in Destiny, because it creates a diversity for each encounter that you go into. For example, you're not using the same weapons on Atreks that you would on Taniks, but there is more there than the difference of duration, and we will get into that in a little bit. Now, for every meta that has been introduced inside PvE, it has never been the hands down best answer for everything. Why is that? Because of those two keywords that I told you at the start of this video, total damage and DPS. Looking not too far back when we had a linear fusion rifle meta, it was the main go-to for Rolk damage at the time for the day 1 raid race, but then shortly after was perfected just in time for the King's Fall raid race, due to Vow of the Disciple giving up a linear with a perk called Bait and Switch on it, granting the player a 35% buff to their linear, and for the fact that during the King's Fall raid race, almost every boss's damage phase was around a minute or longer, granting the linears to be the best option for the job. So now let's jot down some stats from Cataclysmic. Doing 43,922 damage per base shot, and doing 59,295 per shot when Bait and Switch is procced. And with 4th times a charm with enhanced battery, you can get up to 10 shots per magazine, drawing 4 of those straight from thin air, bringing a grand total of 32 shots. And Cataclysmic's total damage is brought to a whopping 1.8 million. Not bad by any means. Now let's compare this to what I would call the current meta for as of right now, being Season of the Deep, and that would be rockets. Some would say that rockets have always been meta. Personally, I wouldn't argue with you. They have always had a place, but in some seasons, other weapons do shine brighter. But let's get into the numbers for the rockets. Believe it or not, I will be using a Bait and Switch Reconstruction Apex Predator for damage testing. Base rocket damage shoots for 93,036, and with Bait and Switch procced 125,598 for a total of 7 rockets. And to just lay the icing on the cake, we are adding the Izanagi swap to it. So a honed times 4 shot goes for 112,448 for a total of 5 shots, which totals to 1.3 million. Ooh. 2v1 and Cataclysmic still won. Who in their right mind would even look at a rocket? Well, I'll tell you, this is what DPS is for. Now, before we get into that, I'm going to give you a huge disclaimer here before all the know-it-all police get on to me, you know. There are several ways to calculate DPS, and depending on how you calculate DPS, you will receive different numbers or results. And believe it or not, it. No matter which way you do it, you will be correct. You see, to calculate DPS, you need to know how long it takes to go from full to empty. So if you only jot the time down for a full magazine to an empty magazine, you will receive a number much higher than if you were to test DPS from full ammo to completely empty ammo, as tested time and time again. So for all my DPS testing, I will be draining the ammo fully, and the time it takes to go from full to empty on Cataclysmic is 47 seconds and 73 milliseconds, nearly a minute. And the time it takes to go empty from Izzy hot swapping is 23 seconds and 58 milliseconds, dividing the respective total damage from each weapon by its time, and you get your DPS. And looking at those numbers on a graph, you get a completely different outcome from when comparing it to their total damage. And keep in mind that this only gets worse for Cataclysmic once we introduce Wolfpack rounds. Not so much for total damage though, but it does get pretty close. But damn! DPS. There is just no competition here. Now to wrap this back to the point of boss duration. In Destiny, bosses average around 30 seconds. Rolk being that 30-second barrier. Because after him, we get to Taniks, Golgoroth, War Priest, and Oryx, which are all leaps longer, some of which can stretch to a minute or longer in damage. And for those bosses, using a linear could be the more optimal choice. But then we get into Sanctified Mine, that Harpy boss, Atrax, Riven, which don't even get close to 30 seconds. And in terms of DPS, seconds compound, and it's a beautiful thing. So I'm about to do two things for you right here, which is one, introduce to you the brand new DPS meta, and two, showing you that the smallest adjustment to your loadout
can make all the difference.
And by doing this, we are scrapping all of the Cataclysmic numbers because we don't need them. We are keeping the Apex Izzy combo, and the combo we will be comparing this to is a triple swap. It would be Supremacy with Rewind and Kinetic Tremors, Wilder Flight with auto loading and just Spike, unfortunately no Vorpal, and Apex Predator. Now as a quick note, you can use Witherhoard in replacement for Supremacy, but if you're in a raid, only one person can use that, so this combo I just gave you applies to everyone. You'll just be fighting over the Kinetic Tremors. But getting into it, Supremacy doing 20,691 per shot and only needing 2 to proc Kinetic Tremors. That will go for 8,506 per shockwave. Wilder Flight doing, all that, just totaling to 37,582, and Apex doing the same as before, which is 93,036 for base shot, and 125,598 for the bait and switch shot, bringing both of their totals to what you see on this graph right here, with both of these options doing nearly the same total damage. But now for DPS, we know that Izzy and Apex is 23 seconds with some change, while Supremacy, Wilder, and Apex's time shows up as 19 seconds and 49 milliseconds, as you can shoot 2 rockets for every rotation just by reloading the first one, and letting Reconstruction just get the other one. And now comparing their DPS, it looks like this. A whole 5,000 faster. What's good, fellas? Ian in the editing stage here. As you just heard, I said that the Supremacy combo is doing 5,000 more DPS, when you can clearly see that it's doing close to 10,000 more DPS. This is unfortunate because I go into an entire explanation using 5,000 as the compounding number. Just know that the compounding here is way more than in my explanation, but for editing's sake, we will just keep the 5,000 explanation. My bad, we all mess up, carry on. What? Not crazy enough. Let me explain. This is DPS, damage per second. This means that with every second that goes by, you will be doing 5,000 more damage than your competitor. 1 second goes by, you're 5,000 ahead of them. 2 seconds go by, now you're 10,000 ahead of them. Fast forward 15 whole seconds, you're now at 75,000 damage ahead of them. And this is just talking about you. If you were to take the rest of your team off of Izzy hot swapping and onto Supremacy, Wilder, and Apex, your entire team would have done an additional 450,000 damage after 15 seconds seconds of damage. That's the equivalent of just spawning in a hunter on the field, letting him throw a blade barrage, and then leaving. You added an additional super to your damage just by altering your build and adding that 5,000 more damage per second. The smallest number in the right circumstance can make all of the difference, Guardian. And now that you have a basic understanding for all of that, time to get into weapon and loadout viability. For most players, they will see an encounter and divide up their weapons to be a jack of all trades. This weapon is for standard ad clear, this weapon is for when I meet the yellow bar, and this is for the boss. And in the end of the day, it does get the job done. But if you want to take it to that next step, you gotta start making all three of these focus for the maximum return. As a good perspective quote from my friend Karma, who is an avid low man Sherpa, though he probably won't admit that, where I ask him on his opinion as to why single weapon damage is just worse for boss DPS versus alternatives like rockets. He said, in my opinion, Leviathan's Breath is not the best option for majority of cases. You're stuck with a weapon that can't do swap rotations, unlike rockets with bait and switch, and it doesn't synergize with any exotics to a significant degree, such as Radiant Dance Machines or Rain of Fire. That last part specifically talking about how Leviathan's Breath can't synergize with those exotics. But the question arises, if all of your weapons are just for single target damage, where's the ad clear? Fellas, every class has access to the most viable ad clear you will ever see. Titan with throwing hammers, warlocks with sun bracers, and those combination blow hunters. And let it be known that the switch from this loadout to this is the difference between a 4-phase becoming a 2-phase and a 2-phase becoming a 1-phase. And now that you have the basic understanding between DPS loadouts and build crafting becoming separate entities, let's get into ease of use. Essentially, what is the right weapon for the job that plays hand in hand with, the easiest weapon for the job? And in this segment of the video, I'll be going over some general knowledge that the community holds, but we are still going to go over it because it's important. And that is, why not just run the highest DPS weapon that is available in the game? Call it a day for everything else, which according to sources like D2 Damage Generator and testing on my own behalf, in terms of single weapon DPS, Acreus is just the hands down best you will ever see in your life. So why not just settle down, to the wind with everything else? Well, range is one of those things. Oh, well then, just opt in for the next best highest DPS that is ranged, which for single-use weapons would be Leviathan's Breath, surprisingly enough. But what if you're at Oryx, War Priest, maybe Golgoroth? We're gonna be doing for the other half a minute. Primarying him? It's time to dump DPS and opt into total damage, which makes Acreus and Leviathan's Breath both irrelevant, What happens if the boss is close quarters, but you're not a warlock? You gotta have some form of healing, and 5 seconds of that healing nade ain't gonna do it. You have to gauge the fight. And I don't doubt that most of you already knew that, but it's still very important to go over. Maybe as a refresher course, you could just take it like that. But that about does it. Believe it or not, this video took a lot of work to make. Fact checking, reaching out to sources. Some things in this video, they might actually still be wrong, despite me, trying my best to make sure everything is as accurate as possible. But what are you gonna do, If you have enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, please. I'll see you guys back over at the weapon reviews. Peace.